This is MOIN. MOIN is a practitioner organization, policy organizations around the world, really, who are interested in missions, market shaping, more proactive government role in shaping policies to deliver better outcomes, right? And of course, this is for many organizations, this is quite a change in the business as usual. So there's much more proactive, much more engaging way of doing public policy, but it's also much more focused on experimentation, learning, all of those things which are, we all love those things, but it's very difficult to do actually in practice. And what we see is that organizations who are practicing that, some of them are putting out their own toolkits, guidebooks, guidelines, how they did it for others to learn from and to share from. And so these are the workshops are really driven by this idea that we learn from practitioners in the field. And of course, the toolbox, every toolkit or toolbox is imperfect because it tries to deal with a very complex reality and provide us with ways of simplifying that reality. So this is, of course, also interesting for academics to understand how policy practitioners are actually dealing with complex problems and complex realities, and how do they develop tools. So, and of course, for practitioners, it's interesting to see what others are doing. So last time, I think that the videos are available online. So we shared with the MOIN network those videos, and this time we have a very similar structure. So we have a first presentation is from the organization, Innovation Policy Organization itself, who has developed this toolkit. And then the other one is from an organization that has been supporting policy organizations in developing those toolkits. So last time we had similarly Vinnova and Fraunhofer. So it's a slightly different perspectives. And as you see from the timings, we try to give 15 minutes for the presentation, 20 minutes for the discussion, and then we repeat the same one. So the first one, without further ado, we have Amelia from CSIRO, which is an Australian innovation policy or applied research agency, and they have done a wonderful work around missions, very interesting mission playbook that they are convening missions that they published maybe a month ago, and highly recommend it. It's a very enjoyable read, and I think it's a very, very interesting synthesis of a lot of the thinking around missions, and yeah, definitely highly recommend it. But Amelia, floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Rainer. So Anna, I'm going to share my screen now.
Thank you. We can see that clearly. Your audio just cut out, but hopefully we can hear you now.
Okay, that might just be my voice. So let's see how we go. So good evening, everyone. Rainer said it's 1 p.m. It's actually just past midnight Sydney time. As he mentioned, so I'm the Executive Manager for Mission Innovation Strategy and Design at CSIRO, which is Australia's National Science Agency, and I have a really bad cold. So I'm going to try to enunciate as clearly as I can, but please feel free to
Sorry, Amelia, you slightly cut out then.
Your audio's a bit unclear. Okay, hang on.
But we can hear you now, okay.
Okay, so you just keep telling me, Anna. So I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I really want to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are this country's first scientists, engineers, innovators, and systems thinkers. And as the custodians of the oldest living cultures on Earth, for more than 65,000 years, they've been practicing their intellectual, cultural, and scientific knowledge. And I'm going to loop back to that because I think it's actually really pertinent to the work that we're doing now. But to start off with, I'm going to talk to you today about our CSIRO Convening Missions Playbook. That's still working. So in 2019, CSIRO announced that we would commence a missions program, and then we publicly launched the program in 2020. We've got a portfolio of 13 missions, 8 of which have launched and 5 still in development, and they began launching in 2021. So if I reflect on why we're in a position to do this now at CSIRO, I think it's twofold. Firstly,
when we launched our missions, we were really in a process of building up our program design around the existing missions rather than being able to start with our program design and then move forward to define our missions. And so that's led to this really rapid, sometimes chaotic process of working through and experimenting with different processes and tools and frameworks. And I think that after 3 years, we're finally in a position where we feel as though what we're doing is stabilized enough that we can turn it into a coherent narrative. And I think that's a really important first rationale for doing this work. It's part of innovation practice, right? The second thing is a little bit, I would say, more foundational. And it was this narrative has persisted about CSIRO's missions program since its inception, that it was in some ways different from anything that we could see overseas. So when we looked to programs, when we looked to the EU, when we looked to Japan and others, what we saw were these programs where the innovation policy was really being mobilized and driven, and that directionality was being mobilized and driven by a couple of key factors. One of which was an organization that had been given a mandate to drive a mission-oriented innovation policy agenda. The second was a clearly articulated set of policy priorities. And the third was an attendant bucket of money that you could disperse through grant making to help to mobilize the innovation system. And CSIRO's model from the get-go was defined by the absence of those three things. So we instigated the missions program at our own behest, using our own impact agenda as the framework for working out what to pursue. And from day dot, what that meant was that we really, by necessity, had to crowd in the investment that we needed to pursue missions. We needed the innovation system to mobilize its resources and its capability to actually deliver on the missions. And I think those things are relatively well understood. What we'd never examined are what are the implications for design and governance of this very different set of drivers. And through the process of doing this playbook, what surfaced was that what's required here is the co-design of mission priorities with a wide array of stakeholders and a constant mediation between converging and diverging agendas within the innovation system. That therefore requires that you've got governance that's really about how to orchestrate that cooperation as opposed to how to disperse funds or investments. And then finally, that all of this really comes down to the way in which your authority to do that is circumscribed by the way in which the innovation system recognizes or doesn't your authority to convene. And so that's really, this process of doing this playbook has really helped us to articulate that. But in order to make the playbook useful, what we really need to do is to think about ourselves as an organization and what therefore makes this work for us. And CSIRO is, as I said, Australia's national science agency. For more than 100 years, we've had a mandate, a legislative mandate, to deliver science and technology for the benefit of the Australian community and to further policy priorities. So we're a natural trusted advisor to government. But we're not just that, we're also an industrial research organisation with an express mandate to help Australia's industry, large and small, deliver industrial research through to solutions. We're part of a very dynamic and competitive and world-class research sector in Australia that nevertheless does occasionally find the opportunity to collaborate with one another on areas of national priority. And then finally, we're more than just a science organisation, we're a national institution. So the analogy here would be the BBC. We occupy a specific place in the Australian imagination. We're one of the most trusted organisations in the country. And we have a clear role to play in delivering science education and engagement, in defining what the STEM priorities and pipeline look like for the next couple of decades. And then through hard-won expertise and effort, we also have this critical role and legitimacy to engage on the ground with communities, and in particular with Indigenous communities. So I think those are the key things that we think may be preconditions to make this agency convene model work. What you will notice in all of this is that there's a real focus on the dynamics of the innovation system. And I think that the last thing that I want to highlight before I get into what the key features of our playbook are that I think that the formulation of what we think a mission is has a slightly different emphasis than others that I've seen. So this top section here will be pretty familiar to most of you. It talks about all of the different kinds of interventions required and the policy and the practice required. But then if we move to this second thing, we know that missions are about scaled solutions. They're about accelerating those solutions. But I think what tends to get de-emphasized is the fact that they're also about improving the way that the innovation system functions. And if we go back to those constraints that I illustrated earlier about our model or perceived constraints, it explains a little bit why this is such a clear focus, that without this better functioning innovation system, we're not going to get the solutions. We won't mobilize the directionality that we need. So if I move into some of the features of our playbook, the first to highlight is this really our foundational artifact and process, which is our theory of change. And this is a modified theory of change. And what you see reflected here is this dual imperative of the impact delivery at scale, which is articulated through these three, what we would call work packages or intervention pathways at the bottom. So the foundational and central one is technology, because of course we're a science and technology agency. So if there's no science and technology involved in solving the problem, we don't have a role here. But it's also about that accelerated impact delivery. And so that's why the next work package is really around scaling and delivering into systems of use. And then finally, and I think this is the one that I try to emphasize the most, is the connection and responsiveness pathway. Because what we're trying to do with this is say that as we're moving from foundational R&D through to translation into systems of use, we really ought to be thinking about missions as temporal constructs. We're not creating a series of interventions and then driving them through to implementation. We're thinking very reflectively and reflexively about what we're learning. And so this third pathway here is really about saying, what are we learning from our other two pathways that can actually inform new interventions that we will pursue as part of a renewed theory of change. So that's the first element. The second one is this ladder of outcomes. And what it's saying here is that you define the mission objective and then you work backwards and you say, in order for that to be true, what characteristics of function does the innovation system need to evince? And in order for that to happen, what do we need our network of committed stakeholders to do? And in order for that to happen, what does our organisation, with all of its governance and risk appetite, what does it need to commit to? And when I say that this is a temporal construct, you look over here on the right-hand side and we have this idea of mission maturity, that as the mission matures and moves through its stage gates, which I'll talk about in a minute, that gap between what the mission is undertaking to do and the impact objective ought to close. We're yet to see this happen, but this is the theory. So I don't propose to walk you through this, what we affectionately call the horrendogram. This is the theory of change applied to our Towards Net Zero mission, which is looking to reduce emissions for the hardest to abate sectors in Australia by 50% by 2035, and in doing so generate environmental, societal and regional benefits. The key thing to highlight in all of this, and I know that Anna will be providing slides later, so you can go through it. It is a really useful document that's got some very, very smart people working on it. The key thing here is to articulate that what you saw above that felt quite high level and quite theoretical becomes really practical here, because it articulates what the programs of work are and also what the core capability of mission management that underpins and animates the whole thing is: monitoring, evaluation and learning, this road mapping and pathway activity that lays the groundworks and the permission structures in the innovation system to pursue certain interventions, this acceleration of technology. Second thing to draw your attention to is our iterative design process. So both of these constructs may be familiar to those of you who've worked in innovation, practice and policy before, but I think the combination of them is worth drawing out here. This is a really key way that we're able to keep consensus for change within the innovation system and firmly embed the mission over its life cycle of 7 to 10 years into the National Innovation System agenda. And what we're seeking to do with this is also to avoid the STI trap, the science, technology, innovation trap. There's always the risk for missions that are catalyzed by a national science agency, that they fail to ever scale outside of that foundational R&D, that they fail to ever incorporate the full extent of socio-technical interventions that are really required to achieve transformational change. And so what this iterative design process does is it acknowledges the fact that that the mission as originally conceived is inherently limited in its scope. But what it does is use this stage gates process, not necessarily as a governance mechanism, which is how it's usually used, but actually as a series of predictable point in time pathways, I guess, that allow a mission to continue to reconsider whether or not it really has the full constituency that it requires to execute on its impact objective, whether it's really considered all of the interventions that are required. And the expectation is the answer to both of those things will be no, and it will be no over and over and over again, usually until you get to this scale up and pivot stage where some of our missions are currently sitting. Sorry, 1 second. There we go. So the second last element of the playbook to draw your attention to, and I'm aware that we're running short on time, is this concept of managing the missions themselves as a portfolio. And I think this is also quite different. So what you see here is CSIRO's entire portfolio of missions. There are 13 of them and 3 enabling programs. And that's a really relatively large number. And that's not by accident. It's planned, and it's because they're each addressing different facets of a societal challenge. So what's animating this is this idea that missions they need to drive accelerated action, and they also need to intervene at scale. And there's a real potential tension in there. If you emphasize the acceleration too much, then you risk narrowing the available interventions. And if you emphasize scale too much, you risk this real decision paralysis. How will you ever know how much of the system is enough? How will you ever know that you've incorporated enough stakeholders, that the interventions are enough? And you tend to get stuck in this cycle that isn't well disposed to act at pace. And so what this approach has allowed us to do is not to consider these missions as siloed research programs, but actually to start thinking through the ways in which, if we zoom out, these missions can help to solve the problem at scale. It requires that the missions program office, of which I'm a leader, actually engages in active portfolio management. And what that looks like in practice. So this is our portfolio of energy and decarbonisation missions. It allows us to pursue 2 things that I want to draw out. The first of which is, many of you will be familiar with this idea of different mission types or mission typology, that you have accelerator missions and you have transformer missions, and they're animated by different kinds of dysfunction, and they're pursuing different kinds of interventions and different scales of interventions. And so this approach allows us to essentially run a large-scale experiment about which of those kinds of models really works and which doesn't, and why that might be the case. It also allows each of our missions to be really responsive to the specific facet of the challenge that they're intervening into. And the second thing that I really want to draw attention to is the fact that the other thing this allows us to do is to start thinking through the synergies and the trade-offs that exist between our missions. So in the ordinary course of things, research programs are governed in silos, and there's not a lot of cross-fertilization of ideas, but also not a lot of visibility about what one another are up to. And so to draw out a really concrete example, our smart energy mission is pursuing a series of interventions to try to radically transform Australia's energy system, to make it smart, to make it sustainable, to make it capable of taking up all of this renewable energy that Australia will generate, but also to drive equitable outcomes for consumers. And that's going to require enormous changes to physical infrastructure, quite aside from anything else. At the same time, our Towards Net Zero mission is pursuing decarbonisation, as I said, and one of those, the hardest to abate sectors, is obviously transport, and they're pursuing a research program around sustainable aviation fuel. Both of these missions are contemplating things that will require land use change in circumstances where that land use change is likely to take place in the same region. In the absence of this active portfolio management, these 2 missions from the same organisation trying to help solve facets of the same problem could potentially pursue interventions that are contradictory to one another rather than mutually beneficial. And so this approach allows that visibility across missions, and allows us to pick up early and identify early where those synergies or potential contradictions or trade-offs are going to exist, and to manage them actively. The last thing to draw your attention to from the playbook is really this question of mission additionality. So we know that missions are highly visible, they're highly participatory, and they, for those reasons, attract a really substantial overhead. They're a long-term commitment and they involve a lot of experiments and risks, and so that makes organizations nervous. And what we really need to know is this actually paying off? And specifically, how do we know that it's paying off, not in comparison to doing nothing at all, but in comparison to configuring this research activity in the way that you ordinarily would with a business as usual research program, where you have a clearly defined and confined agenda from the get-go, and you get your investment and you drive through to delivery. So what we came up with, and this is still in its very early stages, are these 5 dimensions that we're tracking. And they're really thinking through what is this, what I've heard Philippe from the OECD refer to as double additionality. And so we're looking at asking these questions. Are the missions accelerating the delivery of impact at scale? Are they allowing the orchestration of the innovation system to this directionality that's so central to the mission approach? Are they generating spillover benefits? And this requires us to pay attention in a very different kind of way than those first 2, because the hypothesis for the spillovers is much more difficult. It's quite serendipitous, so you have to be paying attention all the time. And then the last 2 elements are really about, this idea of mission portfolio management and the benefits of that approach, and thinking through, are there specific configurations of work packages or missions that are more or less successful over time than others in achieving their objectives? And then applying that same logic to the portfolio as a whole. So if I think through what are some reflections about what are the strengths here, I think that it is this turning of what seemed at first to be constraints into benefits. So this iterative design process was basically our only way to start to govern missions in circumstances where we didn't have this pot of money. And so that's not only been a practice of good design, it's also been central to the ongoing relevance that we can continue to test market interest in missions. We've actually found that, contrary to what we may have thought to begin with, we are seeing a substantial amount of investment from across sectors, but in particular from the private sector, into missions, and that this is generating almost like a virtuous circle as we become more receptive to our stakeholders in government and the research sector and in the private sector. That makes us better able to pick up on what's shifting in the system and what's likely to be interventions that can be accelerated. And then finally, this diverse portfolio of balancing the acceleration and the transformation impulses within missions. If I think about the things to improve, these are things that are going to require a lot of effort, I think, on our part, and a big focus is for the next year or so. So this sophisticated portfolio management, what I've described here, in the previous slides, is more ideal than it is the reality at the moment. So a sophisticated portfolio management that will need new capabilities within our teams, as well as new knowledge infrastructure. And then finally, a real honest interrogation of whose knowledge and for whose benefit. So if I just briefly go to what's next for us, it's this moving from nodes to networks, from this idea of CSIRO at the center of missions and as a central coordinating mechanism, to this system where you can, using knowledge infrastructure and new capabilities, that you're actually able to govern, almost self-govern, these networks of actors in a much more transparent way, in a way that's going to be much more efficient and that leads to something that looks more like the portfolio management that many of us would like to see missions pursue. And then finally, valuing knowledge systems. So for those of us who are engaged in defining mission agendas, we occupy positions of enormous privilege. The relative weight that we give to considerations of equity, sustainability, and prosperity, to the thousands of small decisions that we make in mission implementation all the time. These are, which activities to pursue, which not to pursue. We're being guided by our own understanding of what the problem is and what best. And in doing so, we're inherently limited in our approaches. And I think this is particularly significant in the Australian context, where there is this, as I said, 65,000 years worth of knowledge that could be leveraged if only we'd humbly engage in a process of co-design and cede ground to other voices. We're starting to see this at an individual mission level. So our drought mission, as we've outlined in the playbook, is pursuing a project around, a large-scale project around Indigenous cultural indicators of drought. And I think when you think about what that 65,000 years worth of knowledge is about, a lot of it's about sustainability transitions. This knowledge sustained the living landscapes of an entire continent for that period and safeguarded natural resources for the betterment of future generations. So the potential to leverage that in furtherance of sustainability transitions seems enormous and is being pursued by individual missions. But I think more broadly, there's a role for the missions program office to take in leading this work in thinking about the ways in which, our knowledge systems, our Western knowledge systems, and an intellectual tradition that's firmly rooted in this idea of a contest of ideas that tends to lead to the ascendancy of one over the other, rather than consensus building, may have limitations in this context, and that we will be best served if we step back and let Indigenous leaders and those with expertise step in and tell us how it is that we can actually cross-fertilize our knowledge in the innovation space to co-produce new practices of co-design and innovation. So that's me done. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Amelia, and we really appreciate you talking through the illness and staying up so late. So thank you very much, and for this wonderful presentation. As I said, I can only recommend highly the playbook itself. If you haven't read it, please have a look. So we want to move now to the next presentation. Iacopo already asked one question, so he's the presenter. So he'll talk about the work that he and others, the colleagues, have done in Temos Helsinki, which again is an organization that helps governments to think through the mission practice. So they have done lots of work, particularly in the Finnish context, with Business Finland, which is an innovation agency, but also with the Prime Minister's office, and also many other countries in Europe, but really across the world. So Iacopo, the floor is yours to present.
Thanks, Amelia. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you everyone for having me. My name is Iacopo, and I work as a policy expert at the think tank Temos Helsinki, but also as a PhD candidate at UCL IIPP, investigating this coevolution of organizations and systems trying to pursue mission-oriented objectives together, along with Rainer and others. A few words about Temos Helsinki. As mentioned, we are a think tank which is based in Finland but globally operating, non-profit and independent. We are motivated, first of all, by an impact model that tries to identify leverages of change within our societal context. Four main ones being governance, economy, infrastructure, and collective agency in decarbonization. And we try to do so by bridging the gap between research and practice, mostly through projects that can be involving progressive governments, international organizations, NGOs, but also private corporations and universities. Our motivation to get into the mission-oriented space is really this understanding evidenced by most of the collective knowledge built in these sessions, but also by surveys such as the one led by the OECD and Danish Design Center, that this global movement of practitioners is facing a number of local implementation challenges in understanding and contextualizing in their own operative reality what it means to do a mission. And it is difficult indeed, as the reporters of this survey have evidenced, to define a clear target for a mission. It is difficult to involve a wide range of stakeholders and design the governance around them. And it's difficult to also devise for them a clearly defined timeline, including in terms of the implications for monitoring and evaluation. The angle for which I want to propose you a potential approach to navigate these challenges is that of strategy. And why is strategy a potentially interesting angle? Strategy is interesting because it's the link that any practitioner, be it a manager or a frontline employee in a public organization that has some discretionality, has to make between the place in which they operate, the ways in which they mobilize and deploy different resources, and the goals they want to achieve. And making a strategy for something as ambitious as a transformative mission is no easy feat, of course, because the goal is very high, the capabilities may lie there in the organization, but it's certainly not clear in advance how one can catch up both with the process of organizational change at the same time of igniting the process of transformational change beyond the organization, exactly the challenge that Rainer was mentioning before. More importantly, we also know that there is already no one-size-fits-all solution to do so, because from a current review of existing mission-oriented practices, which we pursued in a white paper last year as demonstrated Helsinki, we show that the approaches are wildly different in themselves, and for legitimate reason, considering the diversity of contexts in which they're adopted. But this leaves us with many open questions. If there is no one-size-fits-all solution to recognize what a mission is and what makes it distinctive, how do we navigate as an implementation? How do we recognize a successful mission when the signpost is posited in 10 years of time? And how to identify gaps or ill-addressed needs in a mission as we try to implement it? Or ultimately, how do we distinguish a mission that is achieving its purposes from a mission washing initiative that is relabeling existing policies under the mission-oriented label, but not really changing how the organization works as such? Our reflection on this is that it's important for us as practitioners and supporters of meaningful practice, be it in academia or in thinking, that we devise heuristics to grasp the distinctive logic of what a successful mission may look like, and that we provide concrete tools, indeed heuristics, to support practitioners into finding out how to reconcile the places, the capabilities, and the goals, which is what strategy is about. This is something that we experienced ourselves in the context of a project with the Finnish government and members of UCL IIPP, where we basically got the request from the Ministry of Economy to devise an interpretation of what a mission-oriented approach could look like in their national government. The project involved the Prime Minister's office, 8 line ministries, and 2 agencies. And the idea was indeed to provide a sort of collective arena to make sense of what are the main bottlenecks in implementation of strategic priorities within the Finnish context, and understanding what is the distinctive value that the mission-oriented approach could have brought in there. And in order to do so, not only we try to make sense of their problems through different means, including Delphi surveys and workshops, but also brought in other strands of theory. First of all, of course, the notion of mission-oriented innovation as developed by many researchers in different places in Europe and beyond, but also a theory of governance called experimentalism, which is underpinned by more than 30 years of empirical research, and it identifies how different bits and pieces of institutional innovations have grown in unlikely places in order to face the distinctive challenge that I just sketched out in the previous slide. That is strategic uncertainty, the inability to devise the means and ends of collective action where the goals are very ambitious, but the means to do so are pretty sketchy. And we listened to their needs, we explored pathways to impact to bridge the gap between this understanding that would have helped us ground the notion of mission in a more concrete detail and their specific context. And well, the impact verdict is still out, namely because, to be very explicit about the political nature of these processes, in the last spring, at the end of our project, the Finnish government got through a new election. The sensitivity of the topic of missions changed quite considerably. And we pursued an effort to reframe also the distinctive value of the mission-oriented approach itself, not to lose some of the learnings that, in a way, a more progressive government than the one that came out of the election would have been ready to embark upon where they still in power. And in order to do so, even as we are trying in a way to devise the nuts and bolts of what this approach will look like based on our suggested pathways of impact, we nevertheless had the chance to develop a framework. A framework that in a way builds on one specific kernel that resonates quite a lot with what Amelia just said about the elements of success in the Australian context, which is this idea of a knowledge infrastructure, or as Rainer just pointed out in his most recent paper, the epistemic turn, that eventually what makes or breaks a mission is the ability of a system to re-engineer itself around the production and the elaboration of new information, namely because of creativity. The mission being in itself a goal that cannot be achieved through solutions that we know in advance, we need to rely on something that we know will come up or that we expect to come up through the process. But creativity cannot be planned. Creativity always comes as a surprise to us, as a famous political economist once said. And it is precious only in as much as it brings out resources that how we devised a well-defined plan before starting into action, we wouldn't have been able to bring out, exactly because creativity surprises us. Yet there is a fundamental difference between a successful mission and a mission that has good intentions but is extremely naive, which is the ability to shorten and fasten up the transition to learning. So the shorter the transition and the faster the learning, the better. And what we aim to bring in the understanding of missions with this strategy framework is really an approach that stimulates understanding of how in a system can learning from diversity be intentionally and purposefully ignited and motivated. And in this respect, the experimentalist lens of missions brings out 4 key steps that are similar, but also in some respects importantly different from a standard policy process. First of all, in terms of defining the onset, rather than designing a detailed and thorough blueprint, striking a thin consensus among the actors, agreeing on the ends of collective action, even when they're ill-defined, as a leeway to action, rather than devising everything from the start. Secondly, devolving problem solving and creating means of trust into the people that have greater visibility on the scientific, industrial, or technological bottlenecks that the mission is aiming to address, rather than designing a set of preconceived projects, and of course pulling them into a portfolio, but a portfolio that in a way brings out the voice and the skills and capabilities of the actors that the mission is trying to engage. Third, ensuring peer learning among the stakeholders. As Amelia said before, making sure that each actor in the mission-oriented system has visibility on what is happening in other parts of it, rather than using the monitoring and evaluation only as a tool of compliance. The premise of it being indeed that the pooling together of the innovation resources being developed by different actors, be them public, private, or societal, are all essential into the process of collective discovery that underpins innovation. And finally, rather than focusing exclusively on summative evaluation, embedding information continuously into the revision of the organizational blueprint, that means that it uses and the way in which it does formative evaluation substantively. We don't provide one specific or ever completed toolkit in order to understand how these 4 steps can be brought into the processes, mainly because we see a fascinating promise in the possibility of pulling up together the many different efforts that many actors in academia, think tanking, international organizations, and practice are doing in order to develop those means themselves. And rather seeing experimentalism as a meta lens to group them up together and understand what are the different functions that each of these different tools can help accomplish in order to make us design a mission and implement it in a way that is capable of learning from diversity and making sure that experimentation fits into transformation. So in terms of defining, we could include from anything from citizen assemblies to foresight methods or more traditional methods of strategy mapping. And of course, in terms of solving a mission, the design of conditionalities as advocated by Mariana, but also dynamic portfolio management as advocated by others in the system are all essential. In terms of monitoring, learning, and evaluation, risk opportunity analysis, key impact pathways, as well as the development of technical committees are all important. And finally, ways to codify change by means of statute, organizational, or policy reforms, ranging finally into job descriptions of the civil servants that are managing the missions, are all important steps into trying to tilt the knee and move the needle of what an organization can do in order to implement a mission. And what are the promises of bringing this lens? Well, we see that as a possibility of understanding, first of all, what are the boundary conditions of a successful mission, but secondly, understanding what is mission-oriented even when it is not exactly labeled as such. Because indeed, we do have successful cases of transformation from the past. And we want to understand what was so distinctive about them that make them successful so that we can learn from them in the view of further action. I'll bring you very quickly 2 to 3 examples. One is very famous and distinctive. You know all the case of DARPA, but it's interesting, in our opinion, as a segue to the broader implication of the framework, to revisit the case from the perspective of experimentalism in order to identify what is the distinctive logic of governance and management that empowered it. First, the development of technological challenges into sub-research programs, Second, the development of a strong autonomy at the level of program directors into devising the portfolios of initiative, making sure that they could gather as much information as possible and build and iterate their own vision towards implementing the mission in their own specific domains. Third and fourth, most importantly, developing hands-on interactions with the grantees and using stage gate funding methods in order to weed out regularly the projects that were not in line anymore with the strategic priorities, but that would eventually emerge up and fulfill the broader mission in itself. We know what DARPA has achieved, but we also have many more cases that in a way resemble this logic, and by adopting very different institutional innovations, achieved very ambitious goals in very different but conceptually similar ways. Another case in this respect is the way in which the California Air Resource Board, so a regulator agency, has implemented low and zero emission programs in the 90s. Notably, this is not a research and innovation agency. It is a regulator that basically defines the boundary conditions for which a car maker can or cannot produce and sell their automotive products into the Californian state. And the way in which they try to move the needle and the mission of the system in order to do so is by devising stringent standards for the reduction of exhaust emissions from all the vehicles, gasoline and diesel powered, even when the technology to actually do so were not there, but then devising a set of carrots and sticks for the car makers themselves in a way to embark on this project. First of all, because they could not just deny the relevance of the Californian automotive market, which is important, but secondly, because there was the means in a way and the signal for that all the actors would have been involved into this collective effort, and that therefore competition would have moved from developing more efficient or more beautiful or cheaper cars, it would have been on developing cleaner ones. And what happened is that by pulling together and gathering information in a formative fashion from these distributed R&D efforts, and by revising the schedules for the phasing out of certain parts of the vehicles, depending on the emerging results, eventually CARB, as a regulator, kickstarted what we know today as the hybrid and electric vehicle industries. And even as the transition is not, of course, completed by any means, it is an example of how even a regulator, not only a research and innovation agency, can use some of its policy tools to tilt the needle. Last but not least, to give a quick example of how this applies beyond the STI trap, I want to make the case that even the Finnish education system works according to this logic. And this case shows how this mission-oriented experimentalist way of thinking about strategy is not just a way to mobilize ecosystem of stakeholders, but it's also a new way of running bureaucracy in itself. In 2018, we worked as Demos Helsinki with the Finnish Education Agency to understand how they could revise their national curriculum and empower a transformation of how the school system was developing new learning objectives and new subjects for their pupils in order to prepare them for a very different job markets than the one of 30, 40 years ago. And the solution that we developed with them and that made them one of the world-class education systems that is praised widely according to PISA results around the world is by relying on a logic for which the learning objectives are very broad and set but not specified in the national curriculum, where the schools and teachers are empowered to have autonomous implementation of the goals in their own classes, and where finally the agency plays a key role into supporting their peer learning from each other and sharing resources so that the results can not only be cross-pollinated across the different schools and teachers, but also percolate or rise up to the national curriculum again. So what are we doing with this logic, and how are we trying to pull together the suggestions and prompts of these case studies together in the view of further action? First of all, taking care of the context-specific nature of these challenges, we are trying to co-create new strategic approaches with the different stakeholders by understanding with them what is the desired future, so reaffirming the intent, as the UNDP said elsewhere, to understand the demand and coalesce around the mission purpose, but then navigating between the state of play and this desired future in order to grasp the key leverage points that each mission manager or mission-oriented employee has at their own hand with the limits of their own governance and innovation system in order to tilt the state of play towards a new direction, and then specify the content of reform along the way, and eventually supporting into implementation. Here we identify 3 leverage points of such nature among potentially many other ones. There is of course the more ambitious one of governance as such, which is basically the kind of approach that we try to push with the Finnish government, but that we're also pushing with the European Commission in the context of the mission for 100 net zero cities by 2030. There is the level of policy toolkit, where each of these 4 steps that I mentioned before are also representing, as I showed, pools of tools that have been uptaken by very different organizations around the world that one policymaker can take inspiration from in order to understand how to start building similar features in their own organization in their own distinctive ways, which is something that we did for Business Finland in the context of developing mission criteria, and with Formas, Research and Innovation Agency Sweden, to understand how they could rewire the research and innovation funding cycle. And finally, at the level of mindsets. So at the level of the single capacities that each frontline employee in a public sector organization can bring to the day-to-day management of a mission. Something that we embodied in a new ethos of civil service based on wisdom, imagination, collaboration, and humility. Some of our recent interactions, as I said, involve mostly European actors. As I said, the Net Zero Cities mission in the European Commission. We've had preliminary talks with GIZ, as well as with people in South Australia. And we are still working on our project with the Prime Minister's office. And last but not least, also actors at UNDP level in Eurasia. And the way in which we see those interactions, not only a way to test the hypothesis that this framework can bring in terms of helping stakeholders make sense of their own practice, understand where interesting prompts for further action may lie and how they could bring them forward, but also in a way empowering the stakeholders in a way to make their own understanding of it, and in a way build their own frameworks, their own attitudes in this respect. Indeed, as Professor Charles Sable, which is the father of experimentalism in a way, has said to me once in a conversation, the future ultimately does not lie in theory, but it lies in the strategic imagination of those who are making it. And in this respect, I will make the case that those who are making it is not me, but you, all of you. So I see that the role of Demos Helsinki, in a way, IIPP, and all other actors in this respect, is not to provide you with apparently dense and thorough responses, but ultimately flow, but rather to spark the fire and show that there are alternatives that you can build upon yourself in the effort to become mission-oriented. Very curious to hear your thoughts, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Iacopo, for this wonderful presentation.